I'm David Camp with Going to Be Fair. To start, please join me in welcoming the executive producer, Rodrigo García.
Venga, Rodrigo.
Director of this episode and many other episodes, Alex García López. And the script consultant on the series, María Camila Arias. So you all sat in for a bit. Rodrigo, what was it like to watch this on the big screen?
It was beautiful. I mean, I've seen it somewhat during the process, and I saw it finished. But obviously, there's something that the big screen and sharing the experience with 100+ people is always special.
So let's start at the beginning here. This is based on your father's novel, one of the great novels ever written, and he was very reluctant about having this adapted.
That's an elegant way to put it.
That's what I do. So what about this particular approach, length, style, made you want to do it, work on it?
I mean, it was not one reason, but many reasons. I mean, my father didn't want to do it. He on the one hand, he thought, it's better if the book lives in the imagination of the reader. But also, there were practical considerations. It didn't fit in a 2-hour movie, a 3-hour movie, even a 4-hour movie. And then the cost at the time would have meant that it would have to be done in English with Hollywood stars. He was all against it. But he did sometimes muse that if it could be done in many, many hours and in Spanish and in Colombia, he would consider it. So that was part 2. And part 3, lucky for my brother and I, he always said, when I'm dead, do whatever you want. So that has saved us a lot of therapy. But I think basically a few years ago, Paco was saying 6-7 years ago, with my mother was still alive and my brother, and again, we approached it from several points of view. First of all, because of a platform, because of digital platforms and the approach of a platform like Netflix, where every product is local. The idea that it could be done in as many hours as possible. It could be done as a Colombian product, as it were, even if it was going to be globally shown. So we were tempted by that, to do it in Colombia, to do it in Spanish. And then, also more practical considerations, like it's going to be made sooner or later. If not, with us, with our kids, with our grandkids, and eventually it would be in the public domain. But we thought this was a particular intersection of where we were and where series were and where platforms like Netflix were. And again, also coincided with, people around the world, especially American audiences, having overcome their phobia of subtitles.
Yes,
much
that
of
is
it
true.
thanks to Netflix, I think. So I'm done plugging Netflix. So it, again, some personal considerations, some practical, some literary, but it looked like the time was right.
For both of you, when did you first encounter the novel, and what made you want to take on the, I would imagine, fairly daunting task of bringing it to the screen?
Well, I read it many times in high school, and then I read it as reference for other films I wrote, because 100 Years of Solitude is a reference for everything Colombia, and then I read it again for this, and it was really, like, I was really afraid of working on this project. I have to say, it was like, but then after realizing that there was going to be a lot of people working on it, and that the family was behind it, and that it was going to be Netflix doing it, the writers and the directors, we had to overcome that fear, we just had to do it. So, and then since, I've read it like 4 times.
Mine is a similar answer to some degree, like the rest of us Latin Americans. I read as a teenager, and then I read it many years in my 20s when I was living in Europe. And then when Paco called me, it was during the pandemic when I was living in New Zealand at the time. I obviously read it again, first in Spanish and then in English to see how it was translated, you know, how it translates to the rest of the world. And then, as you know, María Camila was saying, it was obviously, you know, incredibly scared, you know, to sort of do it. And I remember how you know, how a book that has such little dialogue, how is this going to be possible to bring that to life? And then when Paco sent me the first version of the script written by Jose Rivera, that he came up with this ingenious idea of bringing the narrator along. And I think when having that instrument, you have Gabo's voice, you have his poetry, his sort of leading us the way and telling the whole story. And I think that moment was when I personally realized, and a lot of the team did as well, that this was possible, that you know, we could possibly do this.
How did you think about the approach visually? Because it is among the most evocative and beautifully described books that I've ever read. I think most people who've read it would say that. And it's also one of kind of boundlessness, right? This book is an enormous, incredible metaphor for civilization. So how do you start, and then what's the language that you develop from there?
So like I was saying, at the time I was living in New Zealand, and I spent a good amount of time there because it was COVID. And I spent over a year just thinking about ideas and you know, looking at my beloved directors like Terrence Malick and Kusturica and Sorrentino and Park Chan-wook and just doing a lot of, you know, coming up with all these ideas. And then I arrived in Colombia and I realized I had to throw all that out the window because I had never been there before. And I realized that not only did I have to sort of start new and fresh, I had to understand the Caribbean culture, because it's very different, the Caribbean culture of Colombia to the rest of the country. Like most countries are, you know, different regions have obviously very different beliefs, ideologies, etc. So I spent a lot of time in the Caribbean trying to understand, trying to observe this culture, and that's where all these sort of visual ideas started to come. You know, the energy of the Caribbean coast, the chaos, the passion. They have a phrase called mamando gallo, which is sort of, they're always joking around constantly, and I think the book has a lot of that. The book is actually quite hilarious at times. Obviously, as we know, it's very dark. It's got violence, it's got passion, but it's actually a really fun read. So I wanted to capture that energy and that with a constant movement of the camera, and especially, like I was saying, we have a very special tool in this story, which is the narrator, who I think, unlike many narrators, you know, I think in most movies or series, a narrator kind of already knows the story that they're telling us, and you've got this moment of like, sit down, I'm going to tell you a story, and they kind of know the ending. Whereas with our character, our narrator, he's discovering the story as he goes along. He's reading the story of his family, of his generations, along with the audience, and therefore the camera was always very much his POV, his perspective of trying to search for the story of his family and what happened to them.
And with the scripts, kind of a similar question. First of all, I'd love for you to just describe broadly what your role here was, and then from there, what it looked like creating episodes out of this book and creating a narrative that could be experienced audiovisually.
Okay, so a little differently from Alex, I think that when I read the novel again for this project, for me, because I had read it a few times, this time around, what really struck with me was the violence in the novel. You know, like I obviously remembered all of the magical realism and the beauty in it and the funny parts, and it's a very fun read. But for me, this time around when I read it, it was just how violent it could also be. So I guess that was when I started working with the writers and reading the scripts that had already been written and working on that. I think that was one of the first things I wanted to really work on, is that 100 Years of Solitude is a story that it's the history of civilization, but it's also the story of Colombia and how violent and beautiful, and how violence and beauty can coexist in this Caribbean place where there's like this happiness and this, like, you know, so that was one of the things that really was really important for me, and it was because of the reading that I gave the book that one time. And then as we started working and trying to have these two worlds coexist, and in the readers, like I remember talking to people, what they remembered most was like these beautiful images, but how can we bring the darkness too, right? And that I think was one of the things that we wanted to do. And then, just the challenge of like writing 100 years, and it's actually, I was thinking it's more than 100 years, it's like 120 years, really, into 16 episodes. Well, that was really difficult. But then I guess what was hard but very interesting was to find within the relationships of the characters, like these spaces where we could find more. Things were suggested, but where can we find more to create it, like to create a story for television, because it's not like television needs characters and needs relationships and conflicts. So that was, I guess, part of my work with the writers, but finding these moments between the characters and how to have certain characters for certain episodes, and so the viewer feels, understands and follows the story, and it's not confused by like 100 years of a family, right?
It's quite a scope. Speaking of Colombia, the production here, it's an extraordinary achievement, very local. So Rodrigo, I wonder if you could take us through the building of this world and what that looked like in terms of what was needed, what was available. I think you had Oscar-winning production designers here.
I think these guys should talk about it, because I thought early on that the best thing I could do was only be available for comment when they asked me for a comment. I think it was already enough of a challenge for the directors, writers, the creative team to be undertaking this, and then to add to that, to have the writer, director, son of the author saying, "Not like that." So I said early on, to the producers and to Paco at Netflix, I said, look, I'm available for comment. I'll give you my feedback. I spoke to Jose Rivera and gave him the only advice I could give, which is, I thought many of adaptations of Gabo's books hadn't worked because there was too much respect for the author. There was not enough adapting. And he took it to heart, and just the boldness of not starting with the moment, which is one of the most famous opening lines in literature, starting at the end of the book. So when I read that first episode, I thought, okay, this is, they're really adapting here. And then the adapting that you were talking about, which is turning, feelings into actions and into, anyway, this is a long way to say that I tried my best to stay out of the way of the production as much as I could.
Can you talk about the building of Macondo a little bit?
Yes, well, it was obviously an enormous team that started even pre-pandemic. Eugenio Caballero, the production designer in Mexico, started, and him and his massive team, drawings and doing all sort of sketches. Then eventually Barbara Enriquez sort of took over because the COVID, kind of slowed us all down for a bit. And then we basically, what it's like filmmaking. It's a sort of creative meets logistics, and we first wanted to do it in the Caribbean coast, but we found that was extremely hard due to the infrastructure. We were on a normal day 600 crew plus. On a big day, it was 1,200 of us or more. Depending on and therefore we needed really strong infrastructure to be close to Bogota, where a lot of the clothing, the costumes, everything was being built and created. So we ended up finding this place called Ibagué. It's sort of in the center of the country, that gave us enough landscape and topography close to the Caribbean coast, plus 40-degree weather every day, which was very nice to film in. And then obviously we ended up building 4 Macondos. We're actually going back to when the story takes place in the Rancheria, which is in the Guajira, which is the sort of desert part of Colombia in the northeast. We went to that region where Jose Alcalde sort of raised, and then eventually, where he kills Prudencio. And when they leave, they go on that crazy 2.5-year exodus, which was obviously all location based around the Sierra Nevada. And then we built those 4 Macondas. So the Macondo that you saw in episode 1 is the sort of first humble sort of village of 300 Macondianos. And then simultaneously we had to keep building all the other ones, the 3 other ones. And it took a lot of manpower. Yeah. I could go on and on, but
Yeah.
I think there's already some behind the scenes.
Person power.
Person power. Sorry.
And you had thousands of local actors being seen for these roles, right? I mean, it was a really huge net that you cast just to find these people.
Yeah, that was amazing. When so Dynamo, the production company, opened the cast to the whole country. I think, if I'm correct, Paco could back me up, but I think it was something like 12,000 people posted themselves for any kind of role, which was remarkable. And then we had Eva and Yolanda were the casting directors from Madrid, but they had an enormous team in Colombia looking for all sorts of cast and talent. And we found some cast where had no experience whatsoever, and they ended up going through about 4, 5, 6 months of training, of rehearsals, and then we had some actors and actresses that had a little bit of experience with independent cinema or theater, and then some like Claudio and Diego and Vina, who are much more sort of well known in the Colombian industry. And then obviously, Melquiades and Pietro are sort of the 2 foreigners in the story.
In terms of the narrative spine of the show, it is an epic, just as the book is. I wonder, though, if you could talk a little bit about Jose Arcadio and Ursula, and how you see that story and how you wanted to wrap your arms around that.
Well, it was it was a challenge, as I said, to tell a story of a family, so many generations. So from very early on, we knew that we needed to have 2 main characters that would carry the whole season. And obviously Ursula and Jose Arcadio were those 2 characters that would carry the season. It was very important to anchor the episodes with them. That way, I think, in the reader, you can jump from, and that's how it's written, you jump from character to 20 years later, 15 years before, and jump back and forth. Whereas in the series, we really needed to have characters that would, carry the viewer. And so we obviously thought of the 2 of them, but I think Ursula is the character that is, I think, to me, the main character, because she's the one that has to, carry the family, but also she's the one that is so afraid of this curse, and that's the curse that, that's what decides her whole family. And so that's how we structured the narratives, through her and her relationships with her kids, and how she sees these kids as potential monsters who could have been born with a thick skull, and that's what carries the whole season. Yeah.
You mentioned reading the book many times once you started working on the show. Did you see it differently once you were going through it and then obviously adapting it pretty directly?
Well, sure, I know I have characters that I like more now, and I think maybe because of how, the adaptation and how they acted, and but I think that what we worked on in the book, I think the 2 can coexist. What I thought about the book before and now, I think, I remember, obviously not everything in the book is in the series. So there's things that I still carry that are not there and that are my own imagination. Other things, I see them differently. But I guess that I do see the characters differently now. I think that, and I see more of them, I think, yeah.
Rodrigo, to close, I'm curious for your perspective on how this has all come together. How do you see it alongside the book? How do you think it is in conversation with the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's an adaptation. It's a series based on the book. I think, when books are as not just as famous, but beloved, not just from a highbrow critical point of view, but from a general readership. Adaptations always divide. People are scared it's not going to be, and other people are passionate to see it. I think it has to be seen as a kind of companion piece. I don't think the series should beat up the book any more than the book should beat up the series. It's a very different experience. and I think it's a very enjoyable one. I mean, just watching today those people living in that world, moving through that world. The risks of putting a face to a character are sometimes made up by the pleasure of seeing a face on a character. So inevitably there'll be divided opinions and debate, but I think that's good. It's not Gabriel García Márquez's 100 Years of Solitude series. It's the series based and inspired by the book, and I think it's great that they can coexist. Yeah.
I think when people get to see a few more episodes, they'll know what a treat they are in for. So thank you all so much for coming out. Thank you all.
Thank you.